What do mindfulness and exercise have in common? Well, it turns out quite a lot. Come on, let's find out a little bit more. Welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner. I'm a mindfulness teacher, and I'm so glad you could join us for this particular conversation today. We're welcoming back one of our previous guests to talk about research around mindfulness and exercise. Now, as it turns out, those two have some common characteristics. They're both training, because yes, mindfulness is training, and they can complement one another in terms of outcomes for people who exercise and also do mindfulness. But I'll let our guest today, Masha Remskar, talk more about it. Our guest today is Masha Remskar. Welcome back to the podcast. Nice to see you again.
Hello, Ted. Thank you for having me back. Appreciate it.
So glad to have you here. And one of the things I wanted to share with listeners is that as of this recording, and I've never had this happen before, I posted about the research we're going to be talking about today just yesterday on LinkedIn. It was a new paper that had just come out, and I'd had 4 alerts waiting for me. And normally I get a trickle in over a couple of weeks about research. Just this morning, I had something come in about something else that came out months ago. Nope, I had a bunch of them all at once, and even more today. So congratulations for a lot of very good press about this work. Congratulations, and glad to see it got
Thank you.
published.
Thank you. We actually just spoke to our press team this morning, and they said that so far it's been picked up by over 60 media outlets around the world. So yeah, happy to see that it is kind of reaching anywhere that it goes beyond Google Scholar, let's say.
Yeah. Well done. And well, let's talk a little bit about it. This is a review of other research. So why don't you say just a little bit about what is this paper about?
Yes, happy to. So the paper we're talking about is a systematic review of behavioral interventions that combine physical activity, so an exercise component, and some sort of a mindfulness-based or mindfulness-informed component. And we look at the effects of those combined interventions for mental health and well-being, so kind of the psychological outcomes, hopefully improvements in psychological outcomes. We first wanted to look at this as a part of a bigger project, my doctoral project actually, that just wanted to kind of probe into, is there potential for, for mindfulness to help with exercise, with supporting people into getting into exercising, and whether that might help improve the effectiveness of exercise interventions themselves, while also obviously providing the kind of boosting of the mindfulness for well-being, which we already know it is very well established. So that's where we started. We said, right, no one has looked at this before. We know there were kind of, individual studies that have cropped up that have combined the two techniques in different capacities and different durations and deliveries, but no one's really said, right, what do we know about this literature base? So that's why we decided to, yes, conduct a systematic review. We looked at any study that had an intervention combining the two, and then also a control condition. So we had a number of different controls, but yeah, in general, that was our premise. What does the research combining exercise interventions and mindfulness interventions say or do for mental health and well-being outcomes?
Yeah, and I noticed you had some very significant, and this is in the paper, which I'll be linking to. So for this episode, folks who are watching, you'll have a link, you'll be able to see this. Is you had very specific inclusion or maybe exclusion criteria, and you looked at a lot of papers. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that and how many you landed with and what that was like.
Yeah, that's always the uncertainty with systematic reviews is you try and put together a comprehensive research strategy that makes sure you kind of capture all of the literature that might be relevant, but you don't ultimately know how many hits you're going to end up with until you actually have it. So yeah, we had, I think, around 13,000 hits initially. So our searches across a number of databases gave us about 13,000 hits, but then that obviously reduced significantly, luckily, when we removed duplicates, and then through screening, basically we reduced that all the way down to 35 studies that were included at the end, so in the final selection. And that probably a worthy note to add is that that goes up to the end of August of 2023. So that was the final bit when we were able to include. But we are hoping to update the review in a few years' time, so that anything that's come out since, or that will come out, from when we talk about it onwards, will hopefully capture that in the next update.
Well, we'll learn some new things from new research that's going to come out that is not out yet, or maybe has come out after that deadline. And especially this paper itself may influence some of the research that occurs on that from what you found. So I want to hear, it appears this is a mix of intervention types. It wasn't all one particular MBI or one particular kind of physical exercise, even among the accepted papers. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what were some of the things, some of the interventions that showed up that were included in this?
So one of the key, almost the key characteristics of the review, and also one of the key issues that we were dealing with in the creation of it, was that we have such heterogeneity, so such differences between the different studies that were included. And that because we have a what we call a complex intervention, so one that is dependent on a number of different processes or systems or components, we had to specify criteria quite clearly, or we tried to, and then we still found that we had to tweak those later on. So some of the examples of what we got through on the mindfulness side, so all of the included interventions, of course, had a mindfulness component to them, but those mindfulness components themselves varied significantly. So out of the 35 papers, I believe 10 referenced a kind of standardized mindfulness-based intervention, such as MBCT or MBSR. We also had some ACT, so acceptance and commitment therapy programs included. And then the rest were even less kind of structured or well standardized, for example. So, we had such variation from, for example, an 8-week, very standardized, very set MBCT course, all the way to for example, a 2-week app-based mindfulness practice where the authors didn't even necessarily say how much to use it for or what exactly are parts of the app. So it was really, really difficult to actually pin down, what exactly did participants do, or actually starting with what did the authors of those studies intend participants to do, what participants actually did, and then try and kind of distill that into some sort of, actionable or something reasonable and meaningful that can now inform research going forward, and that we were able to kind of pull some conclusions out of. So yeah, amazing variability in the mindfulness section of the interventions, and then just kind of repeat that for the exercise component as well, where we had a number of different approaches, from kind of group-based, in-person led walking programs to just kind of prescribed exercise by the GP to, it was really, really varied. So basically what I'm trying to say is there was a lot of variability, a lot of heterogeneity between different interventions, but we did our best. And hopefully we did a reasonable job of distilling that into something meaningful and saying, okay, despite all of this variability, what are the common threads and what are the results telling us?
And that's one of the things that I like about the paper, is this need to be as specific as you can, knowing that there is that tremendous variability. It was not a study of MBCT and marathon runners and that's it and nothing else. It was a very broad reaching kind of research just around there's mindfulness there, there's exercise there. What are some things we might provisionally understand about those influences? So maybe you could say a little bit about that. What were, just in broad strokes, some of the things that you found with that?
Yeah. So what you just said there made me think of kind of how that approach, that kind of broad stroke approach, really reflects the state of the literature base in this space of combining exercise and mindfulness. And we might come back to that. But yeah, what this research really aimed to just start that conversation, to just start saying, right, let's look at this in a more structured way, so that hopefully we now have a starting point, and in a few years' time, we'll be able to see how the findings have changed. But what the research is saying as it stands, and what we found in the review, is that interventions adding mindfulness to physical activity or adding physical activity to mindfulness interventions, they tend to be quite reliably effective in improving mental health and well-being. So across all of the papers we included, none of them, well, certainly none of them led to a reduction or a detriment to mental health and psychological outcomes. Now, when we compare those to control conditions, we saw that compared to passive controls, so that would be things where participants essentially aren't getting very much. So that could be they're put on a wait list or they're getting treatment as usual. So for example, some might have still been on, say, their depression medication throughout. So when we compare to these passive controls, we see the combined interventions are quite consistently more effective. So they help mental health over and above, being on a wait list, which is great news. And then we also compared to more active control conditions, and that would be where participants were getting something more, basically something that controlled either for their attention or that actually gave them some sort of a behavioral intervention as well. So in that category, we had things like being prescribed exercise only, but not mindfulness, or the other way around, being prescribed mindfulness, but not exercise. Or we also had a few that just kind of were attention control. So for example, some health education on how to improve your health or how to live with, say, a chronic health condition that sample was dealing with. And that's really kind of how we were able to, that's how we approached trying to make sense of all of that variability that we've just spoken about. And then, so in comparison to these active controls, we found that combined interventions are not necessarily always effective at being better than just the one kind of active ingredient. What I should say there with these findings is that over half of the studies included were actually in the feasibility or piloting stage. So as a whole, there should kind of be a preface to this review saying that we aim to start this conversation, and what we found was that the literature base is in its infancy itself. So a lot of these studies weren't actually necessarily powered, so statistically powered to detect a lot of the effects, but there is an indication that comparing combined interventions to active controls means that they might not be quite as effective over and above what an active control of maybe just physical activity or just mindfulness might be able to provide. And we're really interested to see more data come in and then maybe be able to unpick which ones of the combined interventions were actually more effective and why that might be. I think that's the question I'm really keen to explore going forward.
Yeah, and there's so much to unpack with what you just shared. I mean, there's the nuance difference, which is a very significant difference between a feasibility study and a pilot study. I am a peer reviewer, and I just declined the publication of a particular paper that did not really land on either, and that was a problem with it. So it's good to see that you have that understanding of that difference, but also the idea of active control groups. So it's you're controlling for the idea that I'm in a group and I put in all this effort and I should see some effects out of it.
Yeah.
Seeing controls for that are always wonderful to see. And there are a number of researchers I know who do excellent work on that. And to see that included as part of the mix, along with those that are the wait list, the no intervention, is also good to see, because there may be some differences there that we can suss out over time.
Exactly. We tried to kind of split all of the studies into the different categories they fall into, and then kind of made sense of each category at the time. So, we did this, for example, for what kind of controls did studies have? Were they fully powered trials, or were they feasibility? We also then did it for effects on mental health. So depending on what they actually measured, we looked at the effects on depression, the effects for anxiety, for stress, a number of different health and well-being outcomes in that space.
So with this, one of the aspects to it, I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about it, is there's an app was used as part of this. I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit about that.
Yes, of course. So this is slightly separate from the paper this has come out, but since the review paper was done, or the review paper was a part of a bigger project, I should say. And as part of that project, we have built on what we have learned from the review and actually created an intervention combining mindfulness and exercise for promotion of mental health and well-being. Mm-hmm. And the app I'm talking about is an app called Medito. It is a completely free app available on Android and on iOS phones, and it is essentially a product of a nonprofit, a mindfulness nonprofit called the Medito Foundation, who I have previously worked with. I was their research officer for a bit, and we did some studies together based on their mindfulness content, and then also created this brand new intervention together. Now, I think Medito, obviously, full disclosure, I have worked with them, but have never been paid by them because they are a nonprofit. So everyone working on it is a volunteer. But why I think they are brilliant and definitely worthwhile checking out is because they are committed to having no paywall ever. So they're essentially providing app-based mindfulness practice, mindfulness sessions, quite similar to what you might be able to find in some other mindfulness apps. They're quite well known, but unfortunately mostly have paywalls. So yeah, Medito basically are committed to providing this for free to anyone. And that is why I think, they are a really worthwhile cause, because we know that mindfulness has a number of different ways it can be really useful and helpful. And while kind of rigorous, standardized in-person courses like MBSR might be the gold standard, we know that that's not always feasible, that it's not offered everywhere, that different healthcare systems vary a lot. So yeah, I do think this is a really, really nice option to have, maybe for someone that's just curious about it, or that, maybe even wants to use mindfulness in a preventative way, for which it is very hard to get prescribed MBSR, for example. Right. But yes, with Medito, we have basically created a series of, we created 2 packs of mindfulness sessions that both aim to support people trying to get more physically active. So the first one very much aims to support people in starting the habit, so in getting active, that's also what it's called. And it's got 30 sessions that people we hope would do daily. They are only 10 minutes long each, and they cover a number of different kind of psychological strengths or psychological skills that we know from literature we should have if we are going to be successful in building an exercise habit. That's the first pack. And then the second pack, the sister pack, has not quite yet been released, but will be later this year. And that one is aimed at kind of supporting the habit as it is ongoing. So at supporting the consistency of it, and it is called Staying Active, quite fittingly.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing about that. And this also ties back to something I noticed in the paper, is that exercise, physical exercise, and mindfulness share some of the same drives, the same areas that lead to having greater effects within mindfulness or within physical exercise. There's some overlap there, and I'm wondering if you might mention just a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think we were all interested in maybe seeing, how the two might combine, and what the effects might be, because as you mentioned, there are ways in which they are similar, in which they work similarly and might have similar effects. But clearly there are also ways in which they are very, very different. So, just the ways in which we might engage in them, or the kind of person that might see themselves as, oh, I'm, someone who's very active or exercises a lot, versus I'm someone who does mindfulness or is very mindful. We find that the profile of these people tends to be quite different, so they might appeal to different populations. But fundamentally, they do have shared mechanisms through which they might work. And one of those, for example, is this sense of kind of motivation. So mindfulness might be able to play into or change some of the mechanisms that we know are important in motivation, or that play into motivation, that might even create it. So we think mindfulness might be a good starting point in helping people develop, really kind of that sense of, why do I want to do this? For example, why would I want to exercise, or how does this make me feel? Mindfulness is really good at developing that awareness, as you know, as one of the very key elements of it. So being able to develop that awareness might then also be good for gauging, okay, so how has this session made me feel? So it gives that insight. Another great shared mechanism that has come through in partially in the review, but also in my previous qualitative work, is both exercising and doing mindfulness have a very kind of grounding effect. They tend to get people in the moment. You are focusing on, what is going on with your body. You're focusing on your breath. You might be focusing on what's going on around you. But quite interestingly, when I first started looking into this combination, I spoke to some people that maybe were a bit reluctant to think about engaging in mindfulness. But then when they spoke to me about what they liked about exercise, they were actually describing mindful elements of it. So they said, oh, it gives me such a great break from my thoughts, or, the kind of busyness of an everyday life, or it really, it reduces stress. It just lets me focus on myself and my body for that moment. And I was listening to this as a mindfulness researcher and thinking, yeah, you are really describing elements of mindfulness here. And that, if anything, just reaffirmed to me that there is something to this combination, and that perhaps we can try and leverage these shared mechanisms to try and just help more people, basically.
Yeah, and it shows up in these complementary ways. I've had many students say that going through an MBSR program in this case, and every time is like, this completely changed my yoga practice.
Yeah.
I'm doing that in a different way. Instead of it being about perfect poses and deep stretches, that's great. There was nothing wrong with that. I was just not really present for it.
Yeah.
It really changed the experience. Or I used to run marathons, and someone I had trained with around about mile 18 tends to get to be a tough spot for a lot of us.
Yeah.
And I saw that he was struggling. And this is a person who was a much more fit and competent runner than I would ever be.
Okay.
They're having difficulties with this, and seeing that, just chatting with them a little bit, and kind of learning that their thoughts about, oh, I can't do this, oh, it's so far, and all of that, they've gotten caught up in their thoughts. And so just doing all like, okay, well, as we're doing this, and then introducing a little bit of presence, and take a look at where you are. See over there, what's that? Well, that's downtown Minneapolis. Yeah, it is. Look at how far you've come.
Yeah.
Training you've done. You've run farther than this already. I know you have, because I was there with you. Oh yeah. And that shift in their energy and their ability to finish was just amazing. So I can't say enough, the very real ways in which these complement one another is a huge part of this research.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, that was a perfect example of how mindfulness can be really, really beneficial in even people who already do exercise. So they might not necessarily be struggling with that, challenge of starting an exercise habit, or being, less fit, so that it might feel difficult, but actually they are already fit. Sometimes it is that mental challenge that we need to overcome. But yeah, I mean, in the space of people who are insufficiently active in particular, I think this could be a really promising tool, because mindfulness and the kind of the reframing, the acceptance that can come with training in mindfulness skills can really, really help people overcome that kind of either all or nothing thinking that, say you're a New Year's resolutionist, keen to start with exercise this year for real, and then one day, inevitably, you miss a workout, and you might be prompted to think, oh, well, that's it. I've, messed up this program, start again next year, next month, whenever.
Right.
Whereas if we've trained in mindfulness, we might be instead prompted to think, oh, well, this happened. It's not ideal, but let's just notice it and move on and kind of continue with the practice anyway. Because in mindfulness practice, as you and I both know, you are just essentially consistently practicing noticing tiny little slips of your concentration or of your, anything, and then just getting back to it and not judging yourself for it. So yeah, that, I think, again, just another way of mindfulness playing into exercise really, really neatly.
Yeah. Well, I want to to explore just one more aspect of this research with you, and that's what are some things that are intriguing for you about this, that doors it opens, or things that are like, oh, we hadn't expected that. That would be an interesting area to research. And where do you think things might go in the next few years too?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, there is so much that I would like to unpack about this field, and I hope to get to in the next few years. I think one of the things that I'm particularly keen on discovering or learning more about is the mechanisms through which the combination really works. So and then also maybe what are the ways of packaging this combination in the best way so that it can be most effective. So this review, for example, looked at what are, broadly speaking, the effects of combining exercising and mindfulness on mental health. But what I'm perhaps more interested in learning is how. So what is that middleman? So whether that be, is it through motivation? Is it through an increased sense of self-efficacy? Is it through changed perspective on our own bodies and wanting to look after them, or changed perspective on failure or dealing with discomfort? There is so much there that could potentially be at play, and I'm incredibly keen to find out which ones, if not all, of the mechanisms are at play there. And then in terms of where I hope and think the field might go is, at the moment, a lot of this literature is, as I said before, in its infancy. So there's a lot of feasibility work, of pilot work, but we also know that is a good sign. That means that people are interested in studying this. And I mean, generally, you do a feasibility or pilot study with the view of then hopefully conducting a full-scale RCT. We also know of some that are currently ongoing, but are just not published yet for us to have included in the review. So hopefully the literature base continues to grow, continues to develop. We get more fully powered RCTs that will actually be powered to detect those effects, so we can then look at them again, what does this mean? And yeah, hopefully look into what exactly works about these interventions, for whom, in what duration, in what type of setting, that all of those things that still, needs to be answered. And I'm hoping to be part of that story and answering them.
Wonderful. Well, you have lots of time ahead, and we live in interesting times, so you'll be able to do that research. I hope you'll come back and share that as this unfolds over time.
Brilliant.
Our guest today, Masha Remskar, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to reading more from you in the coming years. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Ted. It has been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching. I'm glad you could join us today, and I hope you subscribe and share this with others. That's really how that helps. And remember, every moment you have a choice. Just make it the best you can. See you next time.